One in the back, yeah.
Yeah, I have a similar question that might play into this divide between liberal and illiberal world. And where do you see the role of countries like Iran, who are in solidarity with the Palestinian cause, who I think Iran just joined SCO a few days ago.
Yes.
They support Venezuela with the sanctions regime. Do you think that Iran is also part of this anti-imperialist new Cold War axis?
Yeah, great questions. I mean, I'll try to be brief so we can get more voices in. The first thing is that, this is a new mood. So there are no unanimities among countries. There are contradictions. So for instance, Turkey is one of the greatest contradictory states at the time. On the one side, Turkish Airlines flies a direct flight from Istanbul to Caracas. That's a lifeline for the Bolivarian Revolution. On the other side, Erdogan. And so on. On the one side, Erdogan says, no Sweden in NATO because, you guys keep burning the Quran and you have these anti-Turkish people running around. On the other side, Erdogan, who's in jail in Turkey. Let's talk about that and so on. There are contradictions. These are not... You see, one of the things that we have to get out of a little bit, I think, it comes to a lot of our thoughts. We have to get out of a kind of moralistic approach to politics. We have to look for the motions of history. In that way, it's ideological to talk about liberal and illiberal. Because where's the liberal government? What is he talking about? Britain is a monarchy. What liberal? There's a king, sorry, she died. There's a king. So many European governments have monarchies. Many of them have national security laws that are terrifying. I just mentioned what's happening to Junge Welt, what are we talking about? Julian Assange is sitting in Belmarsh prison, set to be extradited to the United States. So the binary, liberal, illiberal, that is an act of ideology. There are no liberal countries and illiberal countries. There are contradictions in the world. There are all kinds of monumental big contradictions and then little contradictions. So it's always the case that since the end of World War II, the Cold War mentality has tried to say the world is divided between free and unfree countries. That's why you have free democrats in Germany, They come from that heritage of Cold War thinking. We are free and they are unfree. Maybe not. Also define freedom, because you're free to starve. Is that freedom? In other parts of the world, people are not free to starve. Like they'll say, China is illiberal, okay? They'll say that. But China has just abolished absolute poverty. India is liberal, but India is rife with hundreds of millions of people can't eat. So how do we define these terms? What are these binaries doing? What work do they do? It's an entirely ideological statement made by Blinken. It's not actually reflective of real currents in history. And they get away with it, and have got away with it for years. It's incoherent thinking, Anthony. You speak French. Read more books. Read Montesquieu. Read people like that. Read Rousseau. You'll understand the contradictions of the state of nature. It's not so clear, Anthony. When he became the Secretary of State, they all said he's so sophisticated, he speaks French. Come on, man. Come on. It's not just speaking French that counts. Read the books too, right? But it comes also to the question of Iran. Again, it's contradictory. Iran plays a contradictory role. I don't see Iran as a great force, in the world necessarily. Iran plays a very complicated role. On the one side, as you say, it stands there on the Palestinian cause. Absolutely, right? Almost absolutely. But, the question of Iran's tensions with Saudi Arabia has convulsed the Middle East. For years, I've thought, you guys need to have a grand bargain. That was cemented, the beginning of it, in China. There are lots of contradictions. So I always reject these sorts of ways in which ideology doesn't allow us to scientifically look at the motion of history. It's not like there's an anti-imperialist camp. I actually don't think that there's one. People talk about the resistance axis. That itself is relatively ideological. I don't think it exists. Sometimes people come together, they fight together and so on. Of course there are groupings. Of course countries stand together. Of course there are alliances and allegiances. The countries like Cuba and Venezuela have a very strong alliance together. Of course countries come together. It's not always shifting. But they also play the contradictions. Cuba has contradictory relations with Venezuela, with Turkey, with Russia and so on. It's complex. With China, Cuba is in very difficult situation right now. Cuban solidarity should be on the top of our agenda. But many of the big countries are simply not doing all that they can do. Those are the contradictions. You see, that's how I would see it. In Europe, we at Tricontinental published with No Cold War a text that was co-written by Mark Botenga, who's the Belgian Workers' Party parliamentarian in the European Parliament. It's an interesting text. Okay, I don't agree with everything that we published in Tricon. This is interesting. I have some doubts about it. Mark Botenga and the No Cold War platform and Tricontinental are saying we need to have an independent European foreign policy. Now, I would say, don't get too excited, okay? Because we're not saying independent European foreign policy that allows you to independently go and destroy countries. That's not really what's on. What's on is maybe you should rethink being, to some extent subordinated to the United States, to NATO. When are you going to close down NATO and give yourself some breathing room? I think that's about where, European politics now, NATO is actually preventing people in Germany from having stable prices. There's a direct link between this conflict that NATO is not allowing to end in Ukraine and the inflation crisis here. It's a direct link. So you get out of this NATO template, as the Indian foreign minister says, maybe you'll be able to stabilize your prices.